Hello, Brobs. We're back with Mars Without Venus, a study of some homosexual generals by Major General Frank M. Richardson. We're on chapter 3 now, and I know it's separated into two sections. The warrior kings separated into two sections, Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great. It's a fairly long chapter of 20 pages or so it'll be broken up into three parts. One part, Alexander the Great, and then two parts, Frederick. Let's get to this bullshit. Warrior Kings. That adventurous traveler and prolific author, Sir Richard Burton, could be called the patron saint of those who suffer, as I do, from foot and note disease. Someone said that his footnotes are the best part of his books. One of his many interests was homosexuality. He investigated homosexual brothels in the East by personal experiment, some said, but malicious gossip, ferocious controversy, and wondering speculation were that strange man's constant companion. His list of homosexual monarchs includes Alexander the Great, Wilhelm II of Holland, Frederick the Great, Peter the Great, and Napoleon. In England, we had William II, whose court was a notorious resort of perverts, Edward II, Richard I, James I, and William III. Any pained surprise which might result from the inclusion in such a list of our noble Lionheart has presumably been lessened by the broad hints in a recent television series. The theme of Nora Loft's novel, The Lute Player, is Richard's homosexual friendship with Blondel. The two greats on Burton's list with whom this chapter is concerned are Alexander and Frederick, who are both also included in the list of great captains compiled by Napoleon himself, too great for anyone to bother calling him the Great. Both Alexander and Frederick were hereditary kings of small countries, whose fame they spread far and wide. The others on Napoleon's list are Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Turenne, and Prince Eugene of Savoy. Alexander III, King of Macedonia, called the Great, 356 to 323 BC. Is that before? Unlike Frederick, Alexander did not write about his deeds because he died when he was only 32, whilst he was still busy conquering. This is sad because he might have joined Caesar and Frederick in the ranks of great military writers. As a pupil of Aristotle, he would have written truthfully. Like Napoleon and Winston Churchill, Alexander read voraciously, and his reading included the works of Xenophon, I'm not sure, who died 4 years before Alexander was born. He possibly profited from Xenophon's Anabasis with its soldierly qualities and practical hints and information about some of the country through which Alexander would travel. For Alexander's own Anabasis, the world had to wait until the 2nd century AD, when it was written by Arrian, Flavius Arrianus, mostly from information left by Aristobulus of Cassandria, one of Alexander's officers, and Ptolemy, son of Lagus, one of the many men named Ptolemy, who campaigned with Alexander. Both of them had probably hoped to shine a little in the reflected glory of their great leader. And it was inevitable. Wait, is that right? Both of them had probably hoped to shine a little in the reflected glory of their great leader, and it was inevitable that the saga should be overlaid with flattery and confused by legend. For Alexander was not only a mighty conqueror and explorer, he was also a god and was worshipped as such long after his death. We could never know how far Alexander himself believed in his own godhead. That was largely irrelevant so long as his soldiers believed it, for it augmented his magnetic sway as a leader and helped him to take them to So far from their homes, he gave his name to as many places as Queen Victoria, and though many of the Alexandrias have vanished from our maps, many remain, whilst such names as Secunderbad commemorate him by the name by which he was and is known in India, Sikander or Iskander. It is often said that the fair hair, blue eyes, and even Grecian noses of Sikander's Macedonians can still be seen among the Parthians around the mountain passes through which Alexander and his troops invaded India, and down with which they were followed centuries later by the Mongol ancestors of the Mughal emperors. This is supposed to be Moguls. The fascinating tale of Alexander's career of conquest has recently been told in a large volume by Robin Lane Fox. I am more concerned with his sexual orientation, but of course you are, Major General. Alexander certainly suffered from a disturbed childhood of the sort which is liable to turn a boy towards homosexuality. His mother, Olympias, a strange mystic priestess of Samothrace, was a curious choice of wife for the rough, hard-fighting soldier. Philip II of Macedon, and certainly a bad choice, for they soon became estranged, and Philip divorced her and married Cleopatra, the first Egyptian princess of that name to assume the role of femme fatale. Olympias, who resented the divorce, had no difficulty in teaching her son to despise his father's rough mountain ways, so different from the refinement and culture of Athens. Philip loved his son in a rather inarticulate way, but felt that he was too effeminate with his woman's eyes, and it certainly does seem from the sculptured heads of Alexander that he was what one might call almost too pretty for a man. Surprisingly, it is thought that he may have been a small man, possibly not even as much as 5 feet tall. Philip was always urging him to take part in manly pursuits, in which Alexander excelled, but his best gift to his son was entrusting his education to Aristotle. Philip did not receive the reward of Alexander's complete trust and affection, though it is hard to say what his true feelings for his father may have been. They seem at different times to have been a mixture of fear, respect, and hatred. I must say that most ancient history, I believe, is 5 times more fiction than more modern history. It all depends upon the mindset of the historian, so I don't believe in almost all ancient history is basically just folklore. Children who for any reason become dissatisfied with their homes and parents may daydream about the offspring of different and often noble parents, fantasy parents much more satisfactory than the dull folk with whom they are condemned to live. Never mind my sniffling either, because every time I drink coffee, I sneeze like a savage. I don't know if that savage is sneeze. How about a sneeze like a consumptive? The son of a king really needed no such fantasy, and for Alexander only a god would suffice. His fantasy father was Zeus, and later the god Ammon. He needed no daydreams of his own, for his mother implanted in his mind the conviction of his kinship with the gods. She repeatedly assured him that Philip was not his real father, and she saw to it that he heard the story that she had been impregnated by Zeus in the form of a serpent. This absurd story may have been just part of her scheming to consolidate her hold on her young son's impressionable mind and to turn him against his father. But can we of the 20th century feel sure that this remarkable woman of the superstition-ridden 4th century BC, this mystic priestess with her belief in oracle and omens, who had herself been possessed by the god Dionysus during the temple rites at Samothrace, I'm butchering that name, I'm sure, but may not have come to believe it. She certainly grew to hate her husband with real bitterness. It was widely believed that after her divorce she encouraged Pausanias, who assassinated Philip. After Pausanias had been hacked to death by Philip's friends, she paid him high honors and gathered his mangled limbs, placed a crown of gold on his head, and laid his ashes near to those of Philip. Even a superficial study of possession and the production of states of ecstasy makes it easy to believe that Olympias could have been convinced about the divine origin of her son. Such a conviction, perhaps the result of some mystic experience during temple rites, is almost more credible than that she invented it at all of her dislike of Philip. Philip himself could well have accepted the situation. It is intriguing to wonder if he doubted whether Zeus was really the father of his handsome, rather precious son. If he could have expressed his doubts in the idiom of today, they might have run somewhat like this. This is the sort of thing one must expect if one marries a nutcase like Olympias. But as she is always hanging around the altar of Dionysus, I can't think why she has the cheek to blame Zeus for the boy. Dionysus is much more the kind of god I would expect to become a snake and get a mortal girl into trouble. But what about Alexander? Faiths and beliefs instilled into a young child's mind at his mother's knee die hard and probably not without leaving some indelible traces. Also, the seers, with an eye on the benefits to themselves of pleasing predictions, were ready to assure him of his divine qualities, pointing out that on the night of his birth the temple of Artemis at Ephesus had burned down, whilst an additional omen was his youthful mastery of Bucephalus, the great horse associated with him all his life. Judging by his name, which means ox-head, he must have been a stubborn animal, and no one else, it was said, could handle him. Long, arduous campaigning with soldiers of mixed races, not all of whom treated him as a god, may have sown seeds of doubt in his mind, but it would have suited him to keep up the impression of believing in his godhead. As an aid to his leadership, the beautiful boy grew into a young man of an affectionate, friendly nature. Throughout his life he was capable of acts of kindness, magnanimity to some of his enemies, and great generosity to his friends, but increasing megalomania and jealous mistrust of any whose fame might compete with his own brought out a cruel streak in his nature. I want to see what this footnote is. Where was it for? Dionysus is much more kind of god I would expect to become a snake and get a mortal girl into trouble. Dr. W. Sargent in The Mind Possessed justifies the suspicions directed towards Dionysus, which I have attributed to King Philip. All right. But increasing megalomania and jealous mistrust of any whose fame might compete with his own brought out a cruel streak in his nature. Heavy drinking contributed to a tarnishing of the golden image of the God King. It has to be said that he was guilty of crimes for which history has found less justification than for the deeds of later dictators such as Napoleon's judicial murder of the Duke of Enghien. Alexander's crimes, which invite comparison with Hitler's and Stalin's, include the massacre of prisoners, the liquidation of his wise and faithful chief of staff, Parmenio, and his son Philotas, the cruel judicial murder of a boy called Hermolaus, who suffered because of Alexander's suspicions about the growing resentment among the Macedonians of his increasing arrogance and his wish that his subjects should prostrate themselves before him, and the murder of the simple, straightforward Cleitus, who had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, yet was killed by Alexander's own spear. Alexander certainly grieved deeply about this murder, which took place when both he and Cleitus were very drunk. Alexander's adoption of Eastern dress and of the practice of prostration was probably due less to megalomania than to a wish to please the Oriental people whom he was adding to his empire. In his efforts to explain this and other aspects of his policy, To his Macedonian soldiers, he showed a wonderful gift for inspiring men. They loved him for his bravery. His lust for personal glory kept him constantly in the forefront of every battle, where his officers told him no general ought to have been. The many wounds which he received, together with his heavy drinking, contributed to his death by lowering his resistance to what was probably an attack of malaria. Of one of his wounds, Quintus Curtius recorded that an arrowhead was stuck in the right side of his chest with severe hemorrhage. The shaft had been cut off, but the barbed arrowhead could not be withdrawn. Critobulus operated at Alexander's request. There was severe bleeding, and Alexander fainted, as a result of which the bleeding stopped and he gradually recovered. When we remember that he later hanged Hephaestion's doctor, we must agree with Sir James Young Simpson, who wrote, "Every modern surgeon must admire the boldness, not less than the expertise of Critobulus, when he reflects for a moment on the fearful peril attendant on such an operation performed on so august a patient, and at a time, too, when surgical science as yet possessed no certain means of restraining surgical hemorrhage." Rumors that Alexander had been poisoned were never entirely quenched, and they are an indication of the clandestine dissatisfaction with his rule. Homosexuality among the Greeks is referred to in Appendix 2. Robin Lane Fox, pages 56 to 57, traces the reasons why Philip's court, in which Alexander grew up, was exceptionally steeped in such practices. Philip and Olympias, worried by their son's lack of interest in sex, hired a whore to liven him up, with predictable results. They then feared that he was impotent. Alexander's well-known passionate love affair with Hephaestion endured until Hephaestion's death when Alexander was 30. Hephaestion is said to have resembled him physically, and there is a hint of narcissism. You think? A feeling that Alexander may have thought that a god should mate with someone like him. Robin Lane Fox, commenting on Alexander's age at the time of Hephaestion's death, writes, "Most young Greeks would usually have grown out of the fashion and have given up or turned to a young attraction. The famous love affair could have endured because of conditions liable to lead to facultative, how the hell do you say that? Facultative homosexuality. Alexander's soldiers, like Nelson's sailors, often had no women aboard, certainly none worthy of the attention of a king, let alone a god. The soldiers who adored Alexander were worried by his indifference to women, though he always treated them with marked courtesy, by his avoidance of female companionship, and especially by his strong objections to the normal practice of having women camp followers with his army. It is said, however, that they were incredulous of the widespread rumors that it was physical love which bound him to his dearest friend, Hephaestion. Alexander was furious when he was offered boys or told where boys could be bought. Some of his senior commanders, fearing that his asceticism would impair the personal quality of his leadership, urged him to take a woman into his tent, and this he finally did, possibly in order to avoid pestering. He chose Barsine, the beautiful daughter of an exiled Persian satrap. Artabazus. Oh, these motherfuckers. She was a widow, older than himself, and he found her company restful and pleasant. In a later chapter, we shall see a similar choice being made by another young General Bonaparte. It's probably that Polish chick whose name I forget now. A year before Hephaestion's death, Alexander married a Bactrian princess, Roxanne or Rashanik. It is often alleged that there was a political motive for this marriage, but it seems that he was genuinely captivated. His son was born some 3 years later, after Alexander's death. What? Oh, wait, let's read that again. His son was born some 3 years later, after Alexander's death. Okay, so the must have died after she was pregnant, I hope. Or maybe he was truly a god. The boy, along with his mother, was subsequently put to death by Cassander, who had been ill-treated by Alexander for laughing when his subjects prostrated themselves before the Greek king. When Alexander married Roxana, his Persian mistress Barsine was pregnant. She had a son, believed perhaps wrongly to be Alexander's own, writes Mr. Lane Fox, adding that Alexander never recognized him, with full honors after his marriage to Roxana. After his final return to Babylon, where he later died, he arranged many marriages between his Macedonians and Persian women, as an act of policy designed to encourage the Macedonians to settle in Persia. Alexander himself married two princesses, Statira, the elder daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, the youngest daughter of Darius's predecessor, Artaxerxes III. I find Alexander's relations with women as puzzling as his soldiers are said to have found them. Soldiers have always been shrewd and interested observers, and I cannot believe that they were left in much doubt about Alexander's homosexuality. By his extravagant conduct after Hephaestion's death, Robin Lane Fox describes how and what wild lamentations Alexander was to show how much he minded about the one sure relationship in his life. In his uncontrolled grief, he was unable to attend to business for a week and would not eat or drink for 3 days. Some accounts have probably been embroidered by legend. Yeah, like the whole fucking history. And Arian found that eyewitnesses' stories differed according to whether they had liked or disliked Hephaestion. Arian wrote, "Some say that for the greater part of that day he lay upon his friend's body and wept and would not be parted till he was forced away by his companions. Others that all the day and all the night he lay on the body. Others again that he hanged Glaucius the doctor, and that for a dose wrongly administered. Others again, because Glaucius had seen Hephaestion drinking immoderately and had not stopped him, but that Alexander shaved his hair in regard for the dead man, and the rest, I regard as not unlikely, and done in emulation of Achilles, with whom he had a rivalry from boyhood." Once again, we shall see a parallel in Napoleon's extraordinary behavior after the death of his favorite Duroc. But the historical precedent suggested by Arian is interesting. Alexander's greatest hero from boyhood had been Achilles, from whom he claimed descent through Olympias. I mean, does anyone really believe this is fucking history? That Achilles was a god's son? And on whom he sought to model himself. Those who knew about this often compared his love for Hephaestion with that of Achilles for Patroclus, at whose funeral Achilles sacrificed youths, horses, and dogs. As recounted in Appendix 2, Alexander's violence stopped short of human sacrifice, and as for the horses, he only clipped off the manes and tails of all the horses in the camp. He sent to Ammon to inquire of the god if he permitted sacrifice to be made to Hephaestion as a god, but he refused. Arian. This again suggests his narcissism. The associate of a god should be a god. Though Hephaestion could be worshipped only as a hero, his name was perpetuated in many ways. Arian wrote, Alexander never appointed anyone to succeed Hephaestion as general of the companions' cavalry, so that the name of Hephaestion might never perish from his brigade, but was still called Hephaestion's brigade, and the image went before it, which had been modeled on Hephaestion. That there was a strong homosexual component in Alexander's nature cannot be doubted. He is said to have remarked when he was told that his sister was having an affair that he did not see why she should not enjoy herself just because she was a princess. Mr. Lane Fox observes, for a man who was to sleep with at least one man, 4 mistresses, 3 wives, a eunuch, and, so gossip believed, an Amazon, the comment was honest enough. Let us say then that godlike in this as in so much else, Alexander's sexual life was polymorphous, a term used by Dr. Clifford Allen. In this category, Alexander was joined in due course by a succession of remarkably polymorphous rulers, the Roman Caesars, of whom only one seems to have been normal. The engaging Claudius. Dr. J. Chapman quoted Gibbon that of all the first 15 emperors, Claudius was the only one whose taste in love was entirely correct. How much more pleasing, Gibbon than do we who must prattle of sexual deviation. How much more pleasingly, Gibbon wrote, than do we who must prattle of sexual deviation. What the fuck does that mean? As for the rest of them, Suetonius, translated by Robert Graves, disclosed a particularly variegated pattern of deviation as a representative example, and because he was a fine general, we may take that bane of schoolboys, Julius Caesar. His adventures were not confined to fighting, his wars and writing the dispatches, which we laboriously translated. Perhaps it was wise of our schoolmasters to keep from us the spicier aspects of his career. When he was 19, he was sent on an official mission to the court of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, with whom he indulged in homosexual practices, becoming known as the king's catamite. A delegation from Rome saw him among a group of naked, effeminate youths, acting as cupbearers at the king's table. Hardly a promising start to a political career, and it is a reflection of the standards in Rome, even so long before its decline, that he could have gone to the top. He married 3 times and had many mistresses. Suetonius wrote that his reputation for sexual license was summarized in a speech by the elder Curio, who described him as every woman's husband and every man's wife. We were talking about Caesar at the end, right? Yeah. Okay. All right, bruv. That's all for now. I apologize for my botching half the text, but whatever. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.